Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiMetzBest22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. It's cold here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Winter refuses to give up its icy grip. And of course, in my view, winter is the invention of Satan and the Antichrist. And so my only regret in life is that I wasn't born in Florida. I was speaking with my father in Nebraska this morning, my 91, and it's like 14 below in Nebraska. So I should at least be happy that it's not 14 below here in northeastern PA. Anyway, enough of that banter. I'm very excited today, a very, very pertinent topic. I'm going to be discussing similar topics in a related podcast coming up here this afternoon with David Dean and Rodney Hauser. But today, I'm very excited to have first Dr. Patrick Jones. Dr. Jones just received his PhD, I believe, in moral theology at the Catholic University of America.
Got
All
it.
right. Who was your dissertation director?
Joe Capizzi, current dean of the School of
Ah,
Theology.
Capizzi. You
Yep.
got the dude, man. The dude. You
You know
got
it.
the dude. All right, very good. And recently hired as well at the Franciscan University, Steubenville, where you will start this fall. Also joining me is a repeat victim of my podcast, Dr. Paul Seaton, retired professor of philosophy from St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, although he continues to dabble in teaching at the college seminary there in Wichita. I just found out he is retired in theory and now lives in Wichita, Kansas. I like Wichita, not too far from my old growing up haunts in Nebraska. Kansans and Nebraskans have a lot in common. Anyway, enough of that. I want to thank you, welcome both of you to the show for starters.
Thanks for having us.
And
Larry, good to see you, Larry.
good to see you, Paul. And Paul has been as well, I want to say, an avid supporter of my blog. He donated, very generously to our fundraiser. And I want to mention that the fundraiser is doing very well, but it's still ongoing. It's not dead yet. And, I don't want to go on the cart, but nevertheless, it's done well. And I thank both Paul and everyone who's donated. Anyway, today's conversation is going to revolve around political philosophy, immigration, globalism, Pope Francis, the church's theology on all these things. And the focus is going to be first on an article that is going to be coming out soon in Perspectives in Political Science by Patrick Jones on the concept of political form and the relationship of that to nation states in the thought of Pierre Manent. And Paul and Dan Mahoney and I have discussed Pierre Manent on this show before. But Patrick has written this article, and he gave this article was originally a paper he gave not too long ago, and there was a symposium on Pierre Manent's thought. That papers were also given by Paul Seaton, Dan Mahoney, and Tom Harmon, all of whom I've interviewed on here. At any rate, I find Pierre Manent endlessly fascinating, and so Paul Seaton wrote to me like a month ago and said, "Hey, let's get this great guy Patrick Jones on the show," and he sent me this article, and it's truly wonderful. So anyway, Patrick, we're going to start with you. Could you please you focus in the Pierre Manent article on the concept of political form? Now, I've read things on Manent on political form before. I believe Andrew Willard Jones even wrote something on this not too long ago. But anyway, please unpack for the listeners and the viewers what Manent means by political form and why it's significant with regard to the relationship of the nation state and issues of freedom and so forth.
Sure. Yeah. So the best expositors of Manent's thought on political form are, of course, Paul Seaton and Dan Mahoney. But maybe what I can do is try to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm trying to connect this with Catholic social teaching, because that's essentially what my dissertation was about. So my dissertation was on the nation state and global governance in modern Catholic social teaching. So the most basic way to look at this issue of political form is going back to Aristotle, right? If you go back to Aristotle, what is the political form that he lives within. It's a little complicated by the fact of Alexander, but Aristotle's Politics, he's trying to give an account of the polis as a political form. Mentions the empire in passing, but doesn't want to give a philosophy of the empire. And so what he discusses are the different regime forms that can be taken within the polis. And this really marks, I think you could say, Western political thought for a very, very long time, this consideration of the distinct regimes. The regimes are the different forms taken by the polis. Now, what Manent does is he says, well, we need, in a sense, an update of Aristotelian political science. Why is that the case? Because if we look at Western history since the time of Aristotle, well, we see a number of different political forms. The polis is not the only political form. Even in its time, you have the empire, which Aristotle doesn't really write extensively about in the Politics. But what do we have more recently? We have the nation. And Paul would be much better at situating Manent's thought in terms of historical context and stuff like that. But it seems to me like this whole concern with political form for Manent comes from a need to give some account of what is this thing, the nation. It's different from the polis. It's different from the empire. It's not the political situation of the Middle Ages. And why is this an urgent question and not just a sort of question up in the air that is interesting to those who like to read about political philosophy? Well, because of, in his case, the European Union. What is happening to the nation following the Second World War? What is this new thing, if it even is a thing, which is the European Union? Now, I guess I'm an American, obviously. So in my dissertation, I don't talk so much about the European Union, but I want to look at this problem more expansively in terms of the project of global governance after the Second World War. So I want to say what Manent's talking about with the nation, yes, definitely a concern in the European context, but also a global concern, right? And so just to situate my own dissertation topic here, it really came from watching Brexit occur. Because when Brexit occurred, my instinct was to say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. If I was English, right, I think I would want to reclaim sovereignty, not just because I think England is the best and everybody else sucks or something like that, but because I thought, well, if I want to live in a democratic society, if I want to be a citizen, well, I need this context that is the nation. And so that's what kind of pushed me into looking at Catholic social teaching. And in Catholic social teaching, as you well know, especially since Pacem in Terris, there is this really kind of strong claim for global government. At the same time, it's coupled with this affirmation of the rights of nations. It was not clear to me when looking at these documents that this was a coherent position, and I wanted to interrogate that. So that's where I am trying to take Manent's thought on the nation as a political form to think through this problem in social teaching. And I guess I just bring up Brexit to sort of say, once again, not just a purely theoretical concern, but it seemed to me, and I wanted to understand why I thought this, that the nation, at least in modernity, is a kind of necessary context for liberty, for citizenship, if we value these things. My dissertation director, Joe Capizzi, I brought this question up to him long before the dissertation, and he said, well, you're assuming you value certain things. You value citizenship. You value liberty. And that seems to lead to what you want to say about the nation. So then I just wanted to inquire into that. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just kind of positioning the project.
Well,
this article.
yeah, well, it answers my question in the sense that it sets up it sets up the conversation. And I'm glad you brought up Pacem in Terris because it kind of looms large in my analysis of these things as well. I'm not an expert on Manent, but my expertise really was in trying to do a close reading of Gaudium et Spes, and that the second half of Gaudium et Spes I think is lousy, and the first half is good. And if you read the Acta of the Council, you realize that the Council Fathers, many of them, wanted to turn Gaudium et Spes into an extended an extension of John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris and his appeal to all people of goodwill rather than specifically to a Catholic audience. And therefore, the second half of Gaudium et Spes gets abstract in a bad way. Uh, anyway, I don't want to do all the talking. I want you guys to do the talking. But maybe you could maybe, Patrick, unpack a little bit more about the problems that you see. In reading your paper, I know that you have certain issues with Pacem in Terris, and unpack a bit. And then, Paul, I want you to comment as well. You're not here just window dressing. You're going to do some work.
I endorse everything that Patrick said, not about me and Dan, but about Manent. So,
Okay, good.
and just to let you know, I reread Pat's essay this morning, and I excerpted a number of passages from it so that we could hear his original formulations. So at this point, since we're trying to frame his thesis and his argument, could I just read two passages?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just towards the end, and basically Pat's thing's got three parts, although it's got an introduction and conclusion, three parts. The problem of, let's say, Pacem in Terris and a global instance, and then Manent, and then turning to an Ordo Amoris in kind of interwar popes. So it's got three nice popes. But towards the end, Pat says, my object is not polemical. And, when you talk about these things, it's a minefield. Passions are stirred. I don't want to get death threats. So at least we need to acknowledge it. It says, my object is not polemical. Instead, I have argued that Manent's science of political forms provides what is lacking in social doctrine, but enabling a more coherent application of social doctrine's own principles. So he comes as a friend of Catholic social thought, even though I have to say, Larry, Patrick, he's read more of it more recently with these issues in mind and lenses than you or I have. So I learned a lot from his dissertation about the Catholic social teaching on world authority. Okay, so then he continues, Manent's science of the nation renders subsidium to Catholic social doctrine. So that's his, at least his intent. He's a friend of Catholic social doctrine and trying to make sense of it since Pacem in Terris and even a little bit pre-war stuff. He just didn't think that that's, well, he says it's got a performative contradiction. There's a certain instability, indeed an incoherence in magisterial teaching that revolves around this global instance and then what the necessarily changed status of a sovereign nation must be. So go ahead.
Yeah. So would you mind if I said like a little bit more about what I mean by subsidium, why my object is not polemical, right? Even when I say something about instabilities or incoherences. What I started to see so sort of two scholars were really influential to me on thinking through this problem, Pierre Manent, obviously, but also Russell Hittinger. I'm sure you're familiar with Russell Hittinger's work.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And so what Hittinger provides that I just found extraordinarily helpful when approaching Catholic social doctrine was really what he calls social ontology. So in his landmark essay, Coherence of the Four Basic Principles of Catholic Social Doctrine, he lays out not only this idea that in Catholic social teaching there are three necessary societies, family, church, and polity, but that principles like subsidiarity really depend on an understanding of social forms in a really metaphysically robust sense. So societies like the family, the church, we'll just stick with those for now, each have a form, and within that form, there's a certain order of action in view of certain ends that belong properly to that society, right? So you can't
The
propria, exactly. And so what Hittinger clarifies in that essay is that subsidiarity is not a principle that says every action should be performed at the lowest possible level. He characterizes that as a sort of devolution model and as a sort of libertarian model. Instead, every action should be performed at its proper level. And if you're able to say what the distinct social forms are, well, you can say what their propria are. Then you can apply the principle of subsidiarity, and you can say, this society has to respect this other society in this specific way. What I found when I was looking at Pacem and Terrace is that this term proprium, or plural propria, is precisely the word that John the 23rd uses when he brings the principle of subsidiarity into the discussion of global government. So he gives a rather robust sort of description of what global government will do, or a global public authority, right? It's interesting that they don't want to use words like sovereignty. They don't want to use words like state. I think there are reasons for that. It seems pretty expansive, though. And then he says, well, of course, by the principle of subsidiarity, the propria of the nations will be respected. But here's the problem that I kind of saw. You need an account of the nation as a political form. There's Manent's contribution in order to say what those propria are. Now, Catholic social teaching since Leo the 13th distances social teaching from political philosophy in this sense. He says, it's not my job to say what the best regime or the best regime of the circumstances is. I think that's a really critical move. That's not what social teaching is doing. But this is
I don't mean to interrupt, but I really want to emphasize that for the viewers and listeners, that the papal tradition of the late 19th and into the 20th century was the church does not endorse a specific political paradigm or regime, that it can live with a variety of different ones. Anyway, and I just want to emphasize that point. So go ahead.
Right, exactly. But here's what I think.
Could I interject? However, that investigation, that topic, is the core of classical political philosophy. Right. In other words, to think about politics, if you eschew talking about regime or ranking of regimes or best regime, you're half blind.
Yeah, exactly. Very good.
So that's an important point, is that, okay, the Pope is not going to make these determinations on regime forms, but we better not then say that Catholics shouldn't care about that. Because if Catholics are political animals, they better care about it, right? Doesn't necessarily mean there's a doctrine on the best regime, but we need to learn how to think about regimes. And so taking sort of what I've said about social forms, if the nation has propria, well, what kind of communal entities have propria? Well, forms, social forms. What Manent does, though, is he is able to give an account of political forms. So the regime science of Aristotle, sort of what I'm arguing, is really important. We should study it, but is not sufficient for thinking through this problem that emerges in Pacem and Terrace. We need to be able to think about political form, and specifically the form of the nation. And then secondly, what is this global public authority thing? Is that a political form? Is it possible to have the nation and this global public authority? So that's where I think, okay, Manent steps in and renders subsidium to social doctrine precisely by thinking through questions of political form.
And I would add, in Pat's development of the, again, performative contradiction in Pacem and Terrace and forward to Caritas and Veritate, John the 23rd, he advocated for this global public instance or authority. And he said, on one hand, the nation continues to have its propria, but on the other hand, he said, but it's not going to be sovereign. And so he actually removed from the historical or traditional nation a lot of its propria. So
exactly.
And that is a conceptual incoherence or problem in the doctrine itself. You know,
exactly.
Underdeveloped global authority, and then acknowledgement of the sovereign nation state, but saying really you really can't do independent treaties, or they're going to be subject to an international instance. So that's exactly. Those are two just, I think, kind of glaring conceptual problems.
Yes. I think you could say, to keep with our language of propria, he expropriates certain activities or responsibilities from nations. And specifically, as Paul says, when it comes to diplomatic affairs, he seems to say, well, we're in a totally new situation. where this will all be done by this global public authority. And we no longer will have high-level treaties and diplomacy. And he even goes so far as to say these are the means suggested by natural and international law, but we're now going to adopt different means. And so that to me, I say, okay, what happened to the propria of the nations? Yeah, exactly what Paul just said.
Yeah, and I was rereading Fratelli Tutti yesterday, Pope Francis's document, and in section 175, he even starts using in terms of his discussion of the relation between international treaties and international jurisdictional bodies and more local. He slips into the language of lower and higher. He he
Ah,
lo he loses the language of the propria, appropriate to each level, and starts talking about lower and higher. And that sent off an alarm bell in my, because I had just finished reading your essay as well, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's not right.
no,
Yeah.
I think Pat has made a discovery that will inform, the research into Catholics' papal doctrines and cause moral theology to kind of reflect much more deeply on, well, the issues of political philosophy. Um, yeah, I was, yeah, I was going to, I had one thought, one more. Oh, yeah. When Pat is reading Pachymentaries and then the tradition a little before it and then after him, he very nicely puts John the 23rd's thought in the form of a syllogism with, major premise, minor premise, and
Yeah, yeah,
conclusion. And I thought that was a very helpful move because uh, the analysis of the contemporary situation and its exigencies has to be a minor premise. And if the circumstances change, you can change the minor premise without affecting principles of the sort that Pat has been talking about later. And so again, this is noticing an incoherence, and it's critical in that sense, but it's not critical of Catholic social thought, or
yeah.
stuff like that. It's just trying to make it more rationally coherent. And then later in his article, Pat just shows that these days nobody believes in the United Nations. Nobody believes in global public authority. People are acknowledging the needs for a multipolar world, and these are UN diplomats who are saying that. It's not right wingers. So so that
Well,
we
yeah.
we we do have a new situation where we really do have to rethink uh, international and I'd say national.
Yeah, with regard to this performative and I agree with everything you just said, Paul, and that cuts to the heart of my next question, which is, you say there's like this performative contradiction in Pachymentaris and other places, Patrick, and that is that in that this acquiescence to these globalist enterprises undercuts in a performative way the propria of the nation state. And along these lines, of course, the legitimacy and value of the nation state fell into disrepute, of course, beginning essentially with World War One in the interwar period, and certainly after World War Two. Look, this is what an emphasis on national sovereignty gives us. Now, I have issues, along with Andrew Willard Jones, with the whole notion of sovereignty attached to the modern nation state. We can talk about that. But there is a sense in which, okay, when you say the modern nation state is, in a sense, at least in a modified way, sovereign within its domain, which encompasses certain cultural and linguistic affinities amongst peoples. But that's led to nationalism, and so there's this denigration. So after World War II, we have to have the UN, we have to have nation states and borders and all of these things absolutely sort of curtailed in favor of the EU, in favor of the UN, and these kinds of things. But that then brings the question, and it's in your article, and I want you to address this so that the viewers understand why we think this performative contradiction is important. What is the value of the, as opposed to empire? What is the value of the nation as a political form? What are its propria? What is its value as a political form?
Right. So I'm drawing from Manent here, and he talks about communion and consent as propria of the national form. So I'll just say a little bit about this. I'll oppose it to empire. One of Manent's critiques of empire, and because he's a careful thinker, he's not just a polemicist against empire necessarily. He actually talks at one point about empire as at least attempting to realize the universality of human nature. That's what empire is trying to do, and he can sort of see a rationale there. Now, what he also sees is the inherent limitations to that project, something that, by the way, a guy like Etienne Gilson also noticed. So number one, you cannot politically concretize universal humankind. That seems to be one of the lessons gained from empire. Even in, look at the 19th century empires or whatever you want to look at. So, but the second point he wants to make about empire, and he's speaking, I think, particularly about Rome here, is that they're not quite civic in the sense of certainly the polis, right? So they tend to focus on peace, and peace is a good thing, by the way. By the way, if they want peace, they need massive armies, Roman legions, the British Navy, right? That's what you need if you actually want peace.
Kratos, power.
Exactly, right. But citizenship and civic life are sort of downplayed in the empire, right? And for Manent, I think he would say this is a little bit of an issue for man, the political animal. Man sort of seeks to self-govern, and he can exist within empires for sure. But I mean, even look at the sort of process of decolonization. What do we see with the process of decolonization, particularly after the Second World War? Well, it's been very fraught, right? Not denying that, but a desire on the part of the former colonies to govern themselves, right? And there's a whole history there and all sorts of political questions to address there. But I just use that as an example to sort of say, man, the political animal does want to self-govern. And so the nation for Manent is not a regime, but what it does is it provides a circumscribed body politic within which you can say, here is the particular people that is undertaking to govern itself, right? In modernity, that happens not through the Athenian assembly, it happens through representative government. But what you do have is, this is kind of a boring way to put it, but accountability. You can say, here are my representatives. They are or are not governing in the way that I think they should be governing. And by the way, I do have a say in who they are, right? And you can say those who are tasked with governing, who hold offices, can say, this is the particular community that I am trying to govern well, whose good I am trying to care for, right? And I think we would say, even in the modern nation state, which is not civic in the sense of the Greek polis or something, we do see, for example, in the American Republic, it's going to look a little bit different, but we do see a real, we care about citizenship, right? We care about being civic-minded people, or at least we should, right? But that's possible in the nation in a way that it's not really in the empire. It seems to me like in the empire, you might have sort of different peoples that exist within this universal structure. They might have certain control over their own affairs, but ultimately they're under a higher kratos, right? It's not really self-government in the way that a nation provides. So I would say that for Manent, he says that the nation as a body politic grants a principle of communion. You have an actual discernible people. And then you can sort of activate the principle of consent of the governed. So political liberty, self-government, requires communion. And that can't happen on a universal level. So
Now, that raises the question, though, of nomenclature. We use the word nation and we apply it to the United States. It's a nation. But is that, in Manent's categories, a political form? Is the United States a nation in the proper? Should California be its own nation? Should Texas be its own nation? Should the Midwestern region be its own nation, and so forth? There is an artificiality to this construct that is America. And I mean, in some sense, I would look at the United States forget our foreign entanglements, that the United States as such is an empire with an increasingly centralized leviathan of a centralized state that through raw kratos, raw power, holds the entire damn thing together. Now, I'm obviously being hyperbolic here, but you get the problematic I'm
Yeah.
trying to set up.
Yeah,
Paul?
I've been answering this question for 20 years. So that is every American reader of Manent says, do his categories fit us? And my quick answer is it's not mania cum difficultate, but it's cum difficultate. So so he primarily has Western Europe in mind, and
Yeah.
with France leading it, but on either side, uh, England, Germany, Italy. Okay, so his categories are much more European derived and fitting. I have many things to say about what a Menantian would say about America. They're largely consonant with what you just said. I First thing is he would pretty much follow what his great teacher Raymond Aron said. Raymond Aron had a lot of context with academics and diplomats, State Department people here in America, but Aron called America an imperial republic. Bringing the two
Yes.
things together. So that does lead to your imperial character, but also somehow or another we do manage self-government through the three levels of government. Now, the top level is completely gone haywire. You and I and many people agreed with that. Okay. So Imperial Republic, I think, does capture Menant's personal thinking about America, and then what else? I make a distinction between pre-Civil War and post-Civil War America.
Yeah.
Uh, they're very interesting facts. Before the Civil War, 90% of Americans lived either on farms or in little towns with less than 5,000. After the Civil War, that was completely reversed. So America, I'm going to say, materially became a nation through the process of the Civil War.
Well, that too, because of the complete lack of credibility that the states' rights concept had
Yeah.
after the Civil War.
And then you could add 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Then if
Yeah.
you do recognize the birth and growth of railroads that connected, the continent. Pause. I'll just say one more thing is I do think the founders anticipated this imperial growth of the colonies become rebellious colonies, become states, because Jefferson famously spoke about an empire of liberty. And so your question is very pertinent. Manent really doesn't talk about it in his writings, but I do think Imperial Republic is the beginning of how he would articulate us.
Well, before we turn it back over to Patrick, there's a reason why I asked that question, because I can anticipate an objection that somebody might make listening to this, like, well, if, as you say, Paul, the United States as an imperial republic can somehow still make the republic part work,
Mhm.
why isn't, and I think John the 23rd even kind of says, well, if we could, if the nation can integrate various different policies, poli, why can't a larger, more globalist jurisdictional authority integrate the propria of nation states? Why is it that America really works, but that globalist thing wouldn't? I'm turning that over to
Yeah.
Patrick. Do you have any comment, or Paul? Either one of
But
you.
just my quick thing is Pierre, he entertains theoretical possibilities. He really does. But he also more fundamentally just looks at the actual course of events in Europe. And he's confronting a unique imperial power in Europe, the EU, which is characterized by a certain understanding of democracy. And Pat, in his piece, just shows how literally incoherent and contradictory the European democratic empire is. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about what he actually is seeing and analyzing in Europe and its contradiction before moving on to the more theoretical
Sure.
possibility.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I mean, Paul knows a lot more about the American Republic than I do. Um, but yeah, I guess one of the things I would say, Well, so I'm sure Paul knows about George Anastopoulos, a sort of famous student of the American Republic. He wrote a book called The Constitution of 1787, which I've read in my American summers, I call them, because over the summer I try to educate myself on America because I have not received formal education on America. But anyway, he introduces the book by talking about the constitutions of the Americans. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to remember the full list, but he sort of says, okay, he's building up to talking about our written constitution, but he says, we share certain unwritten constitutional bonds. So one of them
Yes.
would be, sorry, yeah. So one of them would be our language. He even goes so far as to say, coming from Shakespeare, right? So he points to a literature, a language and a literature. He talks about the Bible, right? It's clear that in early America, there is, and even to an extent now, there's a kind of common presence of the Bible. He talks about our sort of habits and pre-revolutionary institutions of self-government, which Tocqueville will also talk about, right? So my point here is just to say that it seems reasonable to conclude that American democracy, the American Republic, really does have certain specific origins, really does have, in a sense that's going to become complicated by the relationship between states and federal government, a people with common traits, right? Which is different from the history of France. I mean, if you look at the French Republic, obviously it's had numerous constitutions, it's flipped back and forth between republic and monarchy. There's a Catholic history there that we don't have in the United States of America. So I guess this would be one of the things I would say is we actually do have to take stock. We can't just have a sort of purely theorized universality, right? Our democratic practices and institutions as Americans are going to have a lot to do with those origins, which are different from, say, the French, or certainly the Germans, who have struggled to have nationhood and to have republican government for a very, very long time. So that would be sort of one way in which I would say, yeah, these are the real concrete limits to the idea of a universalized democracy.
Yeah. I would under also that answers my question, and I think that answers whatever the objection would be about, well, if we can do it in America, we can do it, at the UN. I just think that you've correctly identified that there are factors that's just not true. But I wondered, no, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to interject. A very famous political scientist who wrote a lot about French thinkers, Larry Seaton, and he wrote a number of very good books, but his best book's called Democracy in Europe. Now, it should have had a question mark after the title, but it's Democracy in Europe. And he explicitly made the argument that Pat just made. How on earth do you form a European civic body from all those different national histories and characters? So Larry
absolutely.
Seaton, Larry Seaton. Yeah.
Well, he's got a good first name. I'll say that. So there we go. All right. So let me raise a related topic that is near and dear to my soul, to my thinking. And it is this, once again, I was rereading Fratelli Tutti yesterday, and Pope Francis says in there that because the human family has in his word, an innate vocation to friendship, that is a different way of saying, I guess, that we are inherently social animals. Because we obviously therefore gravitate towards some kind of res publica, some sort of public thing that expresses that innate vocation to friendship in some way. In that sense, governments are all an expression, in some sense, of social friendship. Great. But one wonders, therefore, if the notion of the res publica, the public thing that instantiates our innate vocation towards friendship, if certain degradations of that instinct, of certain deformations of that innate vocation don't also show up in that we're focusing today on not on political forms and political structures, but in perhaps the emergence of the marginalization of political structures as the res publica. And instead, the rise of what Shoshana Zuboff in her great book calls the rise of surveillance capitalism, and others, well, I can't. I could toss out a million names. I'm sure you know them better than I do. The rise of the alliance between the technocratic paradigm, certain forms of capitalism, the surveillance capitalism, as she calls it, that the internet, that this is now the res publica, that has marginal and whether or not that can actually be that which unites us, which I don't think it can. But anyway, that's a ramble, but there's enough in there that maybe you could comment on that, Patrick.
Paul can go first.
Yeah, Larry, I'm a regular student of your podcast, and I think you and I are probably pretty much on the same page in terms of the reality of the international environment, at least in the West, but maybe with China and others. That is, I think there are two. There's a whole bunch of good authors and good books about globalist stuff, but Shoshana Labus, I was actually recommending her book in Houston last week, and it's very, very helpful. And I do think one needs to read Aaron Kheriaty's book about COVID and what it revealed, called The New Abnormal. And in both those cases, they show that technologically, and then in terms of a full apparatus of global instances and global-minded people, World Health Organization, World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, stuff like that, that really the issue of freedom versus tyranny or despotism is no longer merely rooted in national politics, but it has a international or global dimension to it. And my formulation about contemporary politics today is it's always good and evil, good and evil in terms of life and against abortion. Let's not mutilate kids. Okay, it's moral, but it's also political, and that's the fundamental battle between freedom and despotism or tyranny. And then on top of that, it's civilizational, the West versus something really bad. So I totally agree that a full view of our situation looks at the Leviathan here in America, or if I could put it this way, deep state and maybe the Biden administration. But that's been linked, as we've seen, to so many European and international organizations that, it leaves a lot of room for filling in dots. Just a thought.
Oh, well said. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would sort of ask here is, what do we mean by res publica? And this to me seems to be another contribution of Manent. He talks about what he calls the civic operation, right? The res publica is not just a sort of theoretical entity. The civic operation involves concrete human beings putting something in common, forming something common. And this happens in the instance of political foundings, but not just at political foundings. It's a constant activity, right? Actually, this connects to sort of social ontology, because a social form is not just something that's, it's an order of action. A res publica, similarly, is an order of action on the part of those who are continuously putting things in common. Now, I guess I'll say two things. One thing is, so take, for example, a sort of massive administrative state, a bureaucracy. One question is, in what respect is it a race? In what respect is it a thing? I mean, people often talk about the foreign policy blob, right? Well, a blob is a sort of indeterminate, impersonal thing, if it is a thing at all. And then perhaps it's even more clear, in what sense is it public, right? It seems like it's not public. It seems like it's actually something the public knows very little about, right? And so the state, and I think Manent is very good at this too, the state is not the same as a res publica, right? The state, understanding the sort of sovereign state in modernity, is an important question, but it's not, as Manent will make clear, the state itself is not a political form. It's not a res publica. And then the second thing I'll say real quick, since you brought up Fratelli Tutti, is in Caritas in Veritate, Benedict uses this term res publica, and he's talking about sort of civic friendship, civic participation. When I read that first, I thought, oh, this is great. I mean, he's really thinking about res publica in the classical sense as, citizens putting things in common. But then in the encyclical, it seems like there is no determinate boundary to the res publica, right? Where exactly is the res publica? Does it exist at just any possible level? The higher you go, if we're thinking about higher and lower levels, the more distant you get from any real people. And what do you end up with? Well, it seems like we've seen this very clearly. You end up with managerial governance by a bureaucracy, right? And then the question becomes, is there anything common between those who are ruled by the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats? My parents were both bureaucrats, by the way. So I know these people, and love many of them. But whether we could talk about that as a res publica at all seems highly questionable to me.
Yeah.
Could I add just one
Sure.
note?
No, please.
Yeah, Pat nicely said that politics for Manent are activity of the political animal, putting things in common, primarily by action with his fellows. I think one, though, does need to add, it's mediated or done through speech. So for Pierre, the political animal is both the logos animal and the agent, and then putting speeches and deeds together in common. And that's why all of these disinformation, misinformation laws and, seeking out Germans who do the wrong meme, that's an assault on our humanity. It's an assault on freedom, but it's also an assault on our humanity. So censorship, it's totalitarian, but Pierre more specifically says it really is trying to rip the tongue or silence people who are born to speak about public matters.
And can I just add on to that with speech and the res publica? It seems to me like rather clear that we do need these concrete contexts for there to be real deliberation. What goods are we deliberating about for what people? And if you get to know somebody from, even from Europe, which is rather closer to us than China or Russia or something like that, there's going to be, the deliberations are going to be of a different character. They're going to be about different goods, maybe analogous goods. And of course, nations can have sort of interactions with each other. But it just seems like for there to be common speech, true deliberation about the just and unjust, advantageous and disadvantageous, we need to say, who's talking about whom? And it actually seems to me, though people complain about polarization in our country right now, and there's reasons for that, I'm actually kind of glad that a lot of speech, not all of it's totally civilized, but some of it very civilized, is kind of coming to the fore here. We are trying to speak and deliberate, and there's some real contention and conflict there about the just and unjust, advantageous and disadvantageous. That's a sign of a res publica, if you're able to actually do that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why there's it is very telling, right? That the neuralgic point in it seems to be Twitter or X, as this platform for unlimited expression of public speech. So X has become in some sense, a res publica. There's this forum, this environment in which human beings can come forward and say, "This is what I think. Here is my view on this," without fear of being thrown in jail or whatever. But you correctly point, I mean, and I've seen some really scary things just come out in the past few days about, I had no idea. I knew it was going on in the UK to an extent because I've spoken to people from the UK, but I didn't know what was going on in Germany as well. You can be tossed into jail for simply posting a meme, for example, that falls afoul of the protected classes that the government has established, or that you post so-called disinformation, even though governments routinely publish on purpose disinformation. Our government's made an entire sort of enterprise out of it. Uh, anyway, once again, I'm rambling. Patrick, go
No,
ahead.
can,
I just, yeah.
can we go back to Fratelli Tutti? Because since it's
Yes.
fresh in your mind, I want to pick your brain.
Yes.
So you brought up friendship as a category for Pope Francis, and say a prayer for him. It doesn't. It sounds bad about
No, it
his.
doesn't sound good for our Holy Father at all. And I was saying some prayers for him this morning. Absolutely.
Good. So, but my suggestion, but I want pushback or correction. My suggestion is that the fundamental category for Pope Francis that trumps any and all forms of friendship is fraternity. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and then I just want to take and then it seems to me the next step is fraternity for him is precisely universality that doesn't set up any borders or divisions in humanity. And if that's the case, then Pierre Manent has talked a lot about what he calls the religion of humanity, which has a very similar positive view of the human universal. But I go so. Yeah, what have you noticed in rereading Fratelli Tutti about
Well,
fraternity?
first off, in rereading Fratelli Tutti, uh, I have to be honest. I mean, I'm rereading it. I'm rereading a lot of what Pope Francis has written in the expectation I'm going to be asked to write some things on the Pope should he pass away. So I'm frantically sort of rereading. And I have to admit, I was both more impressed with Fratelli Tutti on my second reading. I read it when it first came out than I was initially, but also more troubled by it. I think I understood it better this time, and therefore I had a deeper appreciation for the good points that it says, but then also a deeper appreciation for its danger points. And I think you've just correctly, I mean, in many, many ways, it's a beautiful meditation upon the necessity of charity in all of our civic relations with one another. In that sense, it reminded me of Rerum Novarum, where essentially the Pope was saying there, we can talk labor, we can talk capital, we can talk this, that, but ultimately everybody just needs to live the Christian virtues. Otherwise, none of this crap is going to work. All right. And that's what struck me when I read Rerum Novarum for the first time. The Pope's saying, in order to have a Christian civilization, you need to have Christians who actually live like Christians. All right. And that's Pope Francis is actually very hard on a soulless, technocratic, bureaucratic state. He's very hard on a soulless liberalism. He's very hard on consumeristic, capitalistic, what I call the collective of concupiscence that our culture and our economy creates. Very hard on all of that. But I also, and I said this, you guys off camera, I also think it's a hot mess of internal contradictions. So to get to the issue of the day, namely the relationship between national borders and immigration, he goes on this extended meditation, a beautiful meditation, by the way, on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Uh, then proceeds, I think, to miss its entire point, which is that love begins with proximity. Love is proximate, not global. All right. But he then goes on to extrapolate from that and then says, well, that means essentially borders are sort of pointless. And he goes on to at great length, right? The universal destination of goods, that private property is real, but it's not absolute. And therefore, if one people has lots of good stuff and other people's need basic stuff, that those peoples have a right to migrate into the nations and so forth that are wealthy and better off. He seems to call into question severely the status, therefore, of borders, but then turns around and says, "Yeah, but you have to have them." I mean, it really, He says at one point, yes, because of this innate vocation to friendship, human beings. That social friendship at home is the first place where we have to look, and then the social friendship at home leads out in concentric circles, finally out into the broader. Sounds a lot like J.D. Vance to me. I could go back and look at what paragraph that was in, but it's there. So, in other words, I think that it's a beautiful document, but it's internally very incoherent. Maybe some of those performative contradictions that Patrick began with here in Patriotism. Anyway, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that I kind of kept coming across when I read social teaching documents, and when I would sort of see what various popes, not only Pope Francis, would say about topics like immigration, perhaps particularly in the last like 50 or 60 years. It was kind of like a sort of double speak in a way, and
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm not necessarily saying it's intentional, but I think that there's a sort of there's there's a lack of reconciliation between certain things. So on the one hand, we want to state, particularly following the Second World War, et cetera, look, there's a universal dignity of the human person. This is not a new idea for Christianity, right? But it needs to be asserted, right? There is a way in which, by our unity of nature, we do share a bond with each other, right? Some kind of bond by virtue of our unity of nature. Now, the problem then becomes, how do we talk about fraternity as a principle concretized, right? So Ratzinger's book, which I'm sure you've read, The Meaning of Christian Brotherhood,
Oh,
is
yeah.
one place where someone does this in a particularly ecclesial mode. If you want to put it in the language of the three necessary societies, he talks about what is the bond of unity or solidarity amongst Catholics and then amongst Christians. And then we can say there is some bond between Christians and non-Christians, but it's not ecclesial solidarity, right? Um, it seems to me like we're okay about on thinking about that, though sometimes it's unclear whether we're really distinguishing between the church and the world well enough. But we really struggle to, I guess I would put it this way. If polity is one of the necessary societies, traditionally in Catholic social doctrine, political community, it seems to be one sort of structural problem in post-conciliar social doctrine is what happened to polity? Where is it? It actually seems to me like what we've done is, in an attempt to limit the state, the modern state, we've actually beefed up the modern state. Because if we get rid of the idea of political form, of concrete republics, right? And we just sort of say politics is nothing but instrumental. It's nothing but certain authorities providing goods and services and basic rights. Well, guess what? You can put those state functions on any level, including the universal level. And so it seems to me here's another sort of twist in the labyrinth. Catholics have wanted to appropriately limit the modern state, right, which poses certain threats. What I think has sort of accidentally been done following the council is we're not sufficiently aware of the threat of soft despotism, something that Tocqueville understood. And Tocqueville thought if we were going to prevent soft despotism, this kind of rule in the minutia of our lives from above, well, we needed to have concrete political units or political communities. So that, I guess, is a kind of fundamental issue, it seems to me, in post-conciliar social doctrine. What happened to polity? Are we afraid of polity? It makes sense to be afraid of the modern state for a number of reasons, but are we now even afraid of our nature as political animals? But because nations continue to exist, because we are, in the phenomenal order, still political animals, authorities in the church will sort of interject and say, and of course, every nation has a right to secure its borders. But then we'll turn around and, once again, performatively deny that right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and I guess what I'm trying to lay out here is that there's sort of, if you go back, there's sort of some philosophical reasons for why you might end up with this performative contradiction in actual speech that's coming from various authorities.
I think that once again, it goes back to this allergy, post-World War II allergy we have to ascribing any propria to the nation as something that is irreducible, either to the polis and cannot be superseded and replaced by a larger entity because there's such fear of the hard despotism. So we end up ironically creating a soft despotism to save us from a boogeyman that doesn't even exist anymore. Hard, at least in the West, hard despotism. And you know, it's the old conundrum of I believe in liberalism, except that I think it's okay to be illiberal towards those who are illiberal, at least illiberal as I've now defined it, and that then justifies the curtailing of free speech and so forth because that's illiberal speech, and even as a liberal, I have a right to suppress illiberal speech.
Very nice statement of the peripety or the conundra that by the way, I do see we're right at an hour. May I suggest we also turn to part 3 of Pat's thing where he talks about the earlier application of the Order Amoris to the nation, because I thought that was a very nice ressourcement, as he put it. You know, not a complete solution to the conundrum between universal and the nation state, but I thought Pat did a really good job of saying what was it, Pius the 11th and the 12th, they applied Augustine to the international order and to the nation in a way that was very fruitful. So I think
Let's move on to that.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was something that I noticed as I read through. I did a Lumen Christi summer seminar on Catholic social teaching, a critical investigation with Russell Hittinger, and we just plowed through. We read so much stuff, and I learned a lot. But one of the things I noticed in the 1930s, right, all the way going up to 1939, Summi Pontificatus by Pius XII, right after the Second World War starts, was that this sort of allergy to polity was not quite there. But instead, what there was a very good sort of theological distinction being made between legitimate patriotism and love of country, which I think are in accordance with our nature as a political animal,
Yeah.
and a egoistic nationalism, to use a term that I think appears in Fratelli Tutti, egoism, right? So in a sense, what I see there is a real ability to think through what's the difference between a kind of problematic nationalism and a love of country, in a sense, a preference for the good of one's own country, not at the expense of others, not in order to become more wealthy, we need to go invade this other country, but rather saying, I have a certain responsibility and duty to my family and to the citizens of my polity, with whom, by the way, I share a lot of different bonds, not just juridical constitutions, but common history, all these sorts of things. And as Paul mentioned, I think the principles that are being used here are essentially the Augustinian distinction between amor sui and amor Dei, right?
Yep.
That there are true and false orders of love, right? And I think that this is actually a really good way to critique a nationalism that would absolutize the nation. I just want to say that when Pierre Manent talks about this kind of nationalism, he basically talks about it as pagan, right? It's a form of paganism. And it's not that the nation should become absolutized or confused with the universal. By the way, John Paul II thought very similarly here. But it seems like in Catholic social doctrine in the 1930s, where they really are wrestling with, as you put it, Larry, hard despotism, real nationalism, right? They're actually articulating this much more completely, much more soundly. And by the way, I'll just name 2 guys who I think do a really good job of this, theologians in that period, Henri de Lubac and Gaston Fezard.
Yes.
Henri de Lubac.
2 of my favorites, my heroes.
I thought that might land with you, Larry. Yeah.
Yes.
So in any event.
But anyway, you know, Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti does talk about true patriotism versus false nationalism. He talks a great deal about the distinction between love of self and love of God, but you know, those basic Augustinian concepts of the 2 cities. He leans heavily on that, but he not only critiques nationalism, he critiques populism in Fratelli Tutti as well. And so let's I want to get to the J.D. Vance controversy because obviously it's pertinent right now, which is I think that the recent letter from the Pope, whether he wrote it or not, is immaterial. He signed off on it. The recent letter from the Pope clearly was provoked by the election of Donald Trump, the repatriations, at least attempt at millions of blah blah blah. All right, so the Pope is very, very clear in Fratelli Tutti that he is a very suspicious of populist sentiments as leading towards all kinds of bad things. We don't have to list them here. Therefore, I really think that there's a a text without a context is no text at all. I think the context of this is that Pope Francis fears that, as on an abstract level, J.D. Vance may be, in some sense, correct. He may have a point. But is the point he's making about we have to first take care of American citizens, then we move out to take care of other people's citizens, is this masking an ugly populist, racist, xenophobic, anti-human sentiment? Is this not, I think the Pope's saying, simply a bad populist theorizing here after the fact in order to justify some heinous approaches to immigration? Anyway, go ahead.
You want me to take that one, or you want
Yeah.
Paul
Oh,
to
yeah.
off?
Or Paul or you, either one.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a whole other sort of conversation what this term populism is supposed to mean. Um, but I think that you're right. I think that probably is the fear, and you can see, of course, the legitimacy if you have like a xenophobia where you simply hate all of those on the outside, where you want to keep, some kind of I mean, racial purity would be a huge problem, but that doesn't seem to be what's operating here in the United States. And one
No.
of those reasons would be, I guess I'll just put it this way. By populism, do we mean the majority of American people and the majority of states elect someone who they think is going to take care of a problem that exists where you are not able to really enforce even your own positive laws, where you're not able to protect the borders of the country, not just because you hate other people for some reason, but because insecure borders are a real problem for a number of reasons. One of them is lawless outlaws can operate there with impunity, right? Okay, so I'm just giving that as one example
Yeah.
of why this is a concrete
The
problem. But
straining of resources.
yeah, and so it seems to me that we really need to be careful distinguishing between a kind of xenophobia, a hatred of all on the outside, and the fact that a rather diverse selection of the American people voted for a president who was very clear about what he wanted to do here, right? So I guess if you're going to call that populism rather than sort of democratic self-government, I'm a little confused, right? So
Yeah.
Larry, the concern about racism or hatred of others or mistreating people, right? Throwing them in dungeons or something, right? That's a legitimate concern, but it's a question of whether it applies here, right?
Instead of dungeons, it'd be cages.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, the cages or Guantanamo Bay. There could be dungeons at Guantanamo Bay. I don't know. Yeah, but that was my concern too. And it's an unprecedented papal intervention. It's very rare that a pope writes directly to a nation, a particular nation, about a burning political issue in that nation. It means it's something near and dear to the pope's heart. And yet, I think he would have been better served to just write an encyclical that is an extension, say, of Fratelli Tutti that specifically looks at the issue of immigration, lay out some basic fundamental Catholic moral principles, and let various Episcopal conferences then adjudicate it on the local level for themselves. By the way, that would be synodal. That would be synodal. Not to simply say, I don't like Donald Trump, I don't like J.D. Vance, I don't like Republicans, and by the way, I really don't like Americans very much, and therefore I'm going to stick my nose into your political apparatus. And I mean, I'm being very not hyperbolic, polemical, right now because even though I'm pro-immigration, I took in an Eritrean woman and her son myself as a Catholic worker. I believe in the universal destination. And I also believe this, and I want to say this, but these are the kind, in other words, if I were Pope for a day, this is the kind of I would say, all right? And that is the United States has a centuries long, maybe even more, history of meddling in Latin American politics and economics, and most of the time not in a good way. We have been directly involved in destabilizing Latin American governments. And so it's not like we are this benign entity that is suddenly now flooded with these poor people and we don't want to take care of them. We are complicit in some of the destabilized situations of Latin America that have led to mass numbers of people wanting to go, say, from Colombia to Texas. Okay, so I have deep sympathies with the pro-immigration movement. Nevertheless, there's a way for the church to address this, and there's a way for it not to address. And I think to simply label the concerns of average Americans who voted for Donald Trump as populist racism, I don't think that actually serves the purposes of forwarding the proper application of Catholic social thought to these issues in a measured and sober way. That's just the way I think about it.
Yeah, and I think, given what you've said here about a larger history and questions of international justice, which are obviously relevant, right? One thing we also have to remember, and maybe this fits into the Ordo Amoris, is okay, don't pretend that history never happened. Don't pretend America has never done a bad thing in its life, right?
Yeah.
But we do need to care about. I think JD Vance has kind of been clear on this. We need to look at the concrete situation on the ground, right? We do need to care about. You could talk about the Ordo Amoris and distance, but maybe you could also talk about the Ordo Amoris and time, right? In the sense where, okay, fair enough, there are a lot of things to think through there in what you just pointed out, Larry, but we do really have a crisis here that actually it's not just that it affects American citizens. I would argue that it seems like it can affect a lot of illegal immigrants pretty negatively. I mean, they are being shuttled here by drug cartels and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So in any event, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, okay, fair enough. These are important things to think through, but we do have an urgent concern that needs to be addressed by those who govern us, right? And that it seems like the American people have wanted to see addressed. Not all American people, right? But we have had an election here. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on that.
But that's the kind of sober analysis I'm talking about. Yeah, we have to take into account, yeah, we did bad things, but that was 125 years ago. Gunboat diplomacy and stealing Panama from Colombia are like ancient history. Okay, let's talk about yeah, absolutely. That's a sober analysis, not here's the Good Samaritan parable, and you guys are violating it, and therefore you're not very Christian right now. That's just useless.
Can I say, I just actually read the letter to the US bishops earlier this morning. I thought I better actually read this. But one of the things that was interesting there was that he says something like the true key to the Ordo Amoris is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And as you just said, Larry, I mean, one of the things I wonder about here is what is that telling us about Ordo? I can kind of see what you're trying to say about Amor, but what is it telling us about Ordo? And one of the things is Pierre Manent it's published in Paul's volume of translations of his essays on the religion of humanity. Manent says something like, if you have these sort of concerns about the immigration policies adopted by the West, this cannot possibly mean that you deny food to the migrant family sheltering under your stairs or something like that. So there's the parable of the Good Samaritan, right?
Right.
I mean, now some people would argue that that means when you have this concrete family before you, that means you cannot put them on a plane and return them to their home country, right? That would seem to be what people are arguing about here. But even for those who would take, for example, Vance's position, I mean, look, we're Christians. Maybe I'll put it in this way. If I was a priest, which I'm not, right? And I found myself amongst like a large group of illegal immigrants, right, on the southern border or something, I would minister to them, right? That's part of the Ordo Amoris. Also, if I was just a citizen down there, I would probably be concerned. I would want enforcement of the border because there are real threats to not enforcing that kind of stuff. But would I deny food to somebody who was starving? Absolutely not. That would be a sin. That would be a mortal sin, right? do you just take these people and throw them back into the middle of the desert that, many of them have died crossing, trying to get
Right.
here?
Right.
No, that would be a real moral evil, right? But that's different from saying you can't send anyone who's come here illegally back on a plane to their home country. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti says that immigration on a mass level like this, it can be harmful to the nation into which these immigrants come in. But he says it's also harmful to the nation from which they leave because it's left an enormous deficit of connections and family and friendship and economic contributions and so forth behind. But he just sort of leaves it at that. And I'm thinking, well, doesn't that then argue for a certain legitimacy to repatriation? Repatriation done on a humane, like you were just talking, in a humane way, on a humane scale, where we work with the native country from which they came to make sure that when they are returned, that the conditions into which they are entering are okay, and so on.
Well, I mean, yeah, and think about, it seems like Mexico, for example, has not done a very good job of policing its border, right? And these lawless entities are operating up there. And it seems like now, in light of some recent events, like the Mexican military is actually moving up there, right? And this might be a good for them as well, right? I can't speak to the political situation of Mexico, right? But I'm just sort of saying this is something where it's like, okay, we have to actually collaborate on this. This isn't just unilateral, you know, one country makes the rules and I don't care what anybody else thinks, right? We do have to
Yeah,
collaborate here, and other countries have their responsibilities too. So,
yeah. Paul, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Oh, you gentlemen talked wonderfully well about a very fraught situation. So, no, I don't. The one thing I tend to add these days about these conversations is I think certainly we need better border control, but I think we also need enormously beefed up two forms of immigration judicial institutions. One for the applicants, to determine their real status, because we got a lot of immigration fraud going on, I think. But with respect to the in-country but illegal or undocumented immigrants, I really think we really need to beef up our judicial system to be able to handle sorting them out, and that's gonna take millions or billions of dollars, and it's going to require exquisite prudence to determine, the complex of their economic contribution, yeah, all sorts of things. So I think if we really want to be serious about
And
ex
to a certain extent, I think remove politics from the immigration issue. And I mean, in this sense, in terms of on the judicial level, the Eritrean woman and her son we took in like 8, 9 years ago. We got a call from Catholic Charities in Missouri. She was there, and can you take her? And of course, I said yes. Send her immediately. We'll take her. And so and it turns out the reason why they wanted her to come to Eastern Pennsylvania, that put her in a jurisdiction judicially where her case for asylum would be heard more quickly by courts in Philadelphia than out in Missouri. So yeah, sure. But then it turns out that the court in Philadelphia just dragged her case on forever and forever and forever and forever, even though a woman who came with her, who was a Muslim. Our friend from Eritrea was Orthodox Christian, but the Muslim woman was granted asylum almost immediately by the court in Philadelphia, even though they both arrived. And my friend, her name is Heaven Hailu, her case languished and languished and languished and languished.
yeah.
So she eventually went to Canada, where she is now. And she has been granted political asylum in Canada. She wants to move back to the United States, but the fact is, I agree with you completely, Paul. Part of the problem is we have not invested the resources to properly adjudicate these cases. Anyway, Patrick, I see you shaking your head up and down.
that's what I always do. So you don't have to pay attention to it if you don't.
No,
I mean,
please do that. You're the guest. You're the guest. Not I'm. Not, I should shut up.
well, I guess this is another sort of place where I think here's another place where, as Catholics, we might sort of really go deep into thinking about our understanding of the philosophy of law, right? So it seems like I'm not an expert on these things, right? But it does seem like we have quite a large body of positive law on immigration that has been ignored, right? It's not that we don't have
Yeah.
any laws about open borders or something like that. We do have laws. They're not being enforced. The story you just told, Larry, it seems like the person that you brought in had under positive law certain rights that she may have been
Yeah.
entitled to, right? But the legal system was not up to actually executing our positive laws. And so this is something where I think in the broader Catholic debate, and even thinking about Pope Francis' letter to the bishops, one of the things that we should be thinking about is proper enforcement of positive laws, right? And we all know if a positive law violates natural law, right, then we have a problem. But it seems like we just have a lot of laws here that may be beneficial, but just are not being enforced. And it
Yeah.
seems to me that here's one problem. Um, my impression is that somebody like J.D. Vance is trying to argue for the enforcement of pre-existing laws. If an ecclesial authority then steps in and says your positive laws contradict the natural law, well, then you have a pretty strong claim being made. It's not clear to me whether that's exactly what's going on, but this is where I think we need to actually think through these things using our philosophy
Yeah.
of, are you saying that our positive laws are intrinsically evil, or are you just saying they're imprudent, right? Um,
Yeah, especially since we have positive laws under the Biden administration that he supported that are intrinsically evil,
right.
that the Pope never, and yet he supported, which clearly violated natural law. I'm talking about abortion, and the Pope remained silent on the issue. Didn't seem to think that that was a burning enough human dignity issue to intervene. So yeah, there's a strange double standard, and to give the Pope his due, maybe he just I mean, we have to understand that in the European, you guys would know this, in the European mind, the abortion thing, just stop talking. It's settled. All right. Only troglodytic morons continue to think that the unborn have any political rights. So just shut up. And I think there's an element of that in the Vatican today as well. Just be quiet about that topic. It's settled. People have decided that. Let's move on to this. But anyway, that's my take on it anyway. Anyway, that was met with silence from both of
No,
you. So
no, no.
I,
Okay, ditto. No, and I think I
yeah,
think I think we do have to put that in the partial credit side of America,
yeah,
as if you're
right,
trying to, give a moral assessment of America.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
remember I have a priest friend from the Netherlands, and he was talking about how he was trying to explain pro-life voters for Trump to some Europeans that he knew, because he said, actually, you guys don't understand that the abortion laws in America are much more liberal than our abortion laws. And
yeah.
he told them what some of these laws were, and they were like, oh my gosh, right? These are the enlightened liberal Europeans, and they see what we're doing here when someone's actually explaining it to them, and they're like, whoa, okay, wow, that's crazy, right? So that's an interesting,
no, that
Well, I think the reason for that is that in 1973, the issue was removed from the democratic process into the hands of the judiciary, whereas in Europe that never happened. So they were able to adjudicate certain legislative compromises on the topic, and that have stayed in place now for 40, 50, 60 years. That even I'm not completely happy with that legislative compromise, but I think it's why they just consider it to be just this settled topic, this settled issue. Um,
yeah,
we've debated that and we've decided. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, Mary Ann Glendon, of course, wrote a very famous book about comparing and contrasting the different regimes, and she said only China and I think one other country had as extreme abortion laws as America did. Because of the Supreme Court. And yeah, in Europe, at least, they debated it. And frankly, also, they did have the memory of the Holocaust and
Yeah.
eugenics that, gave them a certain sensitivity to laws that attacked whole categories of human beings. That,
Lebens unwert Lebens.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that that said, maybe it was better back in the 70s and 80s than it is now in terms of a social consensus, because really, things are moving in the euthanasia direction now in
Yeah.
Europe. That's very worrisome, very
But
worrisome.
it's just, Pope John Paul came from Europe, albeit Eastern Europe and Poland, and he never missed a chance in when he visited the United States and any place in the world to champion the pro-life cause, and to push for this. So in other words, there's a double standard under the current pontificate that I don't really completely understand or fathom. But I mean, to bring it back to Pierre Manent and your article, Patrick, which is excellent, where we're sort of running towards the end here. Uh, I just think that the letter from the Pope was ill-advised simply because all of the issues we've been talking about here today, the issues raised by Pierre Manent and the issues that your article raises, all need to be addressed, as I said, in a sober and sophisticated way, taking all points of view into perspective. And yet the Pope's letter just seemed to be, first off, a hack job and partisan. And I don't understand that at all. But I would hope that, and this is my last point that I want to make, and maybe you guys can comment on it, that the American bishops now, in response to the Pope's letter, will open a deeper and wider conversation based on Catholic social teaching on what will our response be to immigration. It's not like we're not doing anything as a church in the United States on the issue of immigration. We're doing a lot. Okay, I think the American bishops are in a unique position to say something really, really profound on this topic. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I certainly think a couple, maybe three, have already made very measured and genuinely contributory statements. So
Yeah,
now that was before the Pope's letter.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, with the advent of the Trump administration, there's much more latitude for debate and discussion, I think, than during the Biden administration. Now, it's chaotic, as Pat said earlier. So one can hope that Catholics continue to chime in all sorts of ways. And when I read X, watch X, and just get my understanding the complexity of the issue really grows from points of view that aren't mine or that I'm not aware
yeah.
of. So I think it's chaotic right now. It's very partisan, but I think there is a potential for an expansive, productive debate.
Yes, I,
Yeah.
I go ahead, Patrick.
Sorry, can I say a word on that?
Absolutely.
Following up, I mean, this is something that in my dissertation, I one of the things I noticed. So I'm a convert, and one of the things I noticed when I came into the church was social teaching. I'm not sure how it stands relative to political philosophy, but I also noticed a certain tendency over the years to think when a political or social issue comes up, there seems to be a sort of Catholic tendency to say, well, what does the church's social teaching say about it? We can find that, we can apply it, then we're good, because the Catholic Church has a full and complete teaching on social and political matters. One of the things that I think I would like to see us do, as scholars, but also just as Catholics in the parish, whatever, is to first of all try to really get clear on our principles, and then to recognize that, to go back to a theme we've discussed here, as political animals who live in particular communities, we are going to have energetic debates with each other about matters of governance, right? And that, for example, in my dissertation, I sort of note, look, I'm not trying to say that the nation as a form, that's the one acceptable form for Catholics. No. What I would like to do instead is to open up a pathway for Catholics to have debates with each other about the nation, global government, the European Union, rather than just saying, oh, if a Catholic who defends the nation is a nationalist, and that goes against sort of Catholic universalism or something like that. And there's the sort of reflexive or inverse version of that where you just say, oh, you're just a globalist or something like that. So my point is here, I'd like to see Catholics have more to act as citizens, debating things with each other. There's going to be disagreements, but recognizing that a lot of these judgments in political affairs are not just sort of determined from on high by our universal principles. We really do need prudence, and we need to reclaim being citizens, right? Um,
Oh, Amen to that. Reclaim being citizens. Reclaim, to tone. One of the problems with social media too, and I like social media. I'm on it a lot though. Is that we as Catholics need to remember civility. To reclaim our role is to understand it probably doesn't serve anyone's purposes to accuse one side of the political aisle with being goose-stepping populist Nazis and the other side being baby murdering, cross-dressing globalists. You cross-dressing globalist bastards. None of this stuff moves the needle in the realm of civility towards consensus, in other words, towards understanding what the other person's actually really saying. And that's one of my pumps that I have with the Pope's interjection here. It short circuits an attempt to understand what is J.D. Vance really trying to say here. It automatically just assumes he's dog whistling to goose stepping right wingers. That's what it clearly is assuming, that's what he was doing. And yet, I think that's an invalid assumption. So, civility, I agree with you completely. I think civility is
Can I say a
lost.
word on civility, and you can say no if you want?
Go ahead.
And because it connects to Manent, it's relevant to our conversation. In Seeing Things Politically, which is a book of interviews with Pierre Manent, which is just like, that's the gold mine. If you kind of want to see who he is, what's his project, what's his development, and it's also
Yeah.
just fun to read. But he makes this point that I think about all the time. So he talks about his time in the lycée, so his French high school, which is, in I guess the early 60s, late 50s that he's there, maybe mid 50s. But in any case, he says he was raised in a communist household. His father was an ardent communist, and young Pierre Manent was to some degree as well. And if I'm remembering correctly, he says this school was rather more conservative, right? I was kind of the outlier in being the communist. But he says something like this: it's the mark of civilization that they both accepted my political passions and did not reject me for those passions, and that we were able to unite around education, right? So what I love about that is that Manent doesn't say we need to be politically passionless in order to have civility.
That's
No,
right.
instead we need to be.
Oh, I agree with that completely.
Yeah,
I wouldn't disagree with
And,
that at all.
yeah.
and I will add to the autobiographical account. As a young man, he was an atheist, and so he would tell his Catholic friends, "I'm going to disprove the existence of God for you." And
There
so,
for
and
you.
but
Yeah,
he said that never broke our bond of friendship. And what we had in common was the lycée Republican education focused on language and then some disciplines. So,
Maybe we need liberal education.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, I could talk to you guys for hours. I mean, I'd love to talk more about, and I've talked with Paul and Dan about this before, about Manent's attitude towards modern political liberalism. We could go on about that. I also find it fascinating that we're talking about civility and debates, but, in the light of Tom Holland's thesis in his book Dominion, that in essence, all of the modern world has been shaped and molded by Christian values, that Christianity does not understand how total its victory in so many ways actually was. And therefore, that all of these debates we're having, whether you're debating a Marxist or a feminist or a transgenderist or, a Catholic post-liberal follower of Patrick Deneen and New Polity and all that, that these are all in many ways debates amongst Christians and Christian heretics that are Christian derivative uh, forms of thought. And therefore, I have often thought that Catholic social teaching is not theologically robust enough because ultimately lurking behind everything is a theological premise and a theological debate. And all too often we rush into the language of natural law as this sort of neutralist sort of language that we can use to then discuss. One of the things, for example, that strikes me of Fratelli Tutti is how rarely the Pope mentions Jesus Christ. Uh, you know, and it's not just Pope. Almost all social encyclicals are kind of like this. We're going to bracket the theological crap and we're just going to get down into the natural law nitty gritty down here. And I think that, anyway, gosh, I'm on a big tangent
No,
now. No,
could
I'm
I,
trying to wrap up, but that's a
yeah,
bad way to try and wrap up by provoking further conversation. Go
could I
ahead,
say
Paul.
two things real quick? I think what you just mentioned about Tom Holland and the total victory of Christianity, especially in Europe, Ratzinger was the one I think who played that motif most effectively. He constantly said to his secular audience, "You believe in human rights, you believe in the
Right.
absolute dignity of the individual. Where'd you get that idea? And then if you're going to sustain it, what do you have to draw from?" And so he just kept saying, "You guys are freeloading atheists," to use Rorty's famous phrase. So yeah, Ratzinger was great at
I
reminding
agree.
his secular stuff. And then I will say what you just said about Pope Francis. Um, I'm really struck in his pretty extensive oeuvre, although he regularly repeats himself. That's kind of an interesting, just repeats
Quotes
himself.
himself all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, I'd say ad nauseum, but that's me. But
So
it's really remarkable how infrequently the term and concept of citizenship is in his writings. And
that's a
of course, I'm very sensitive to the failure to articulate man as a citizen and all that entails.
excellent point. Patrick, any last words, comments?
Well, I was just thinking of two further conversations we could have on Pierre Manent related to the topics
Go
you guys
ahead. Go ahead.
brought up,
Unpack it.
in the
Yeah.
future. One would be, given what you just said about Tom Holland's book, his essay on the notion of secularization. I can't lay the whole thing out here, but I think that would just be really interesting to think about.
Yes.
Your point about Tom Holland and how what Manent thinks about this idea of secularized Christianity. But on the second point, one of the things I really, Manent keeps his Catholicism a little close to his chest in some of his writings. I think he does that intentionally. But one of the things that he seems to think is that the church should not confuse itself with the world, right? Needs to recognize its distinction as a society with a certain end, right? But it seems like he does think the church, especially in the face of sort of atheist, radically secularized modernity, it can teach people once again how to be citizens, right? Even those who are not Catholic, I think Manent seems to have this sense that our understanding of practical reason, of human nature, of the virtues, right, which is of course baptized and graced, right, in the full sort of Catholic understanding of the moral life, is something that we can communicate to people in order to talk about what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to exercise political prudence or regnative prudence? And that's a contribution that we might be able to make to the wider culture, even those who are themselves not Catholic. Not necessarily by saying, here is our pre-packaged sort of Catholic social teaching account of everything, and we invite you to embrace it along with us.
Yeah.
Educating in the virtues, in human nature, in sort of teleology, in man as political and familial animal. So I think Manent makes a contribution there. So that could
Oh,
be a
that. Well, good. That's an invitation to a follow-up right there. I mean, there's all kinds of other European thinkers that deal with these topics too, like the Italian Augusto Del Noce. I'm a huge fan of Del Noce, even to a certain extent, Giorgio Agamben, who confuses the hell out of me, but nevertheless, he's provocative and interesting. French phenomenologist Emmanuel Falk has some interesting things to say. Anyway, there's so many things we could talk about. So hopefully we can do a repeat of this. But anyway, thank you to Paul Seaton and Patrick Jones for coming on the show today, and thanks to everyone for listening. Bye now.
Thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you.